departmental solutions. So a regional or departmental office can start building its own solutions without having necessarily the sponsorship or even approval of the enterprise as a whole. And you end up with a lot of sort of fragmentation, a lot of departmental solutions that are each locking important data away in them. And this is sort of a good thing and a bad thing. It's good in the sense that it's easy to get solutions to people who need them, to departments that need them. It's bad twofold, especially if you're a system administrator, because one, now you have a much more complicated landscape to keep running, which is probably your primary concern. But from a strategic standpoint, it's even more difficult because a lot of this data, very important data, is locked away in these departmental solutions, and it's hard to get it out. And when you look at almost any organization, the reality is actually far more complicated. It's fragmented even further. Each department has file shares. Each office has them. There are different cloud solutions coming into the picture, and there's very little centralization of all this data. It's really distributed. And no matter how hard the system administrators try, sort of the low bar to entry into solutions on the Microsoft platform encourages things like shadow IT and other solutions sort of sneak their way in. And it becomes almost impossible to really get the big picture of all the data. And this is really important because you look at a lot of organizations, take an insurance company would be a great example. Insurance companies don't make widgets. They really just have information. So they are information companies, although a lot of them don't necessarily view themselves that way, but fundamentally that's all they are. And so how do we make sense of all this fragmentation? You know, it's sort of grown organically over time. Everything's sort of spread out, not really organized the way that you would if you could start all over again, which most IT teams in these environments would love to. How do we go from sort of this overgrown garden or overgrown waste into something that's organized and beautiful and easy to consume, which again is even more difficult because beauty is really in the eye of the beholder. So the people in each of these departments sees different value in the information that they have. So it's hard to say, well, this is the one view of everything. And that's actually a problem that people get when trying to build solutions into this enterprise. Here's where Hadoop really comes in, because this brings a lot of tools that were difficult to work with before or require a different mindset. And I'm hoping everyone's a little bit familiar with all of the layers in this. I didn't really plan to explain them too much. If this is totally new to anyone, feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to talk about them. This is just a slice of the Hadoop ecosystem. There are more pieces to it than this. But these are the ones I care about the most. And so, again, just like in the Microsoft enterprise, there's this storage layer, HDFS. And that tends to be a good place, really, to enter into Hadoop in the Microsoft enterprise. And then at the top, you have these higher level abstractions, which are also another good place. So things like Pig, Hive, and Scoop, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But really, Hadoop is the fabric with which you can start to weave together all these disparate and fragmented data sources to bring sort of coherence and visibility to all the information in a Microsoft enterprise. So it's a mix of new and existing tools. The new tools are going to be all the Hadoop ones. And there are actually, as of this week, there are 2 different Windows-based distributions for Hadoop, although you can be running Linux on them. But a lot of Microsoft enterprises don't mix Linux and Microsoft products that well. And then your existing tools. So these are going to be things like Power View, Power Pivot, Excel, SQL Server, so analysis services, things like that. And this has actually been, this layer between is where there's been a lot of exciting growth over the last year. So the ODBC driver for Hive, for instance, is a very easy way to start exposing Hadoop data right to users who are already comfortable living in their office environment, in their Excel and Power View sort of environments. And what we can do with this then is we can start to look at aspects of our organization that we really couldn't before. And in this example, take a customer, for instance. If you look at a customer for any sort of business, you usually have multiple contact points with that customer. There's going to be some sort of line of business system which has a customer record and something like that. It's going to be transactional. Maybe that's where I buy things from. But there are going to be other ways to interact with that customer too, other ways you already do. So things like your website, which is generating web logs for that same customer using your site. Things like your interactive voice response system, or email and chat, support ticket type stuff. and even social media. So these things generally live in very different places in a Microsoft enterprise, actually in almost any enterprise, because there are different systems for all of them. And what we want to do is sort of build a view for them. And again, this challenges because all these departmental solutions. If you think about something like SAP, SAP would not really, I've never seen SAP be a departmental solution. That's a sort of organization-wide solution, so it's a different animal altogether. And when we look at something like a customer, or we could also look at our products or even our brand, we can see that we're really good already sort of at reporting transactional data. So really just reporting maybe tabular data. It can be summed, it can be sliced different ways, and really it's just raw transactional. Although we still have a challenge with pulling this transactional data together, that's usually what we're doing with OLAP type solutions or current analysis type projects. But we're missing dimensions to this data. If it has dates, it's really only used for chronological ordering. It's not used for any sort of intelligence beyond that. So we can look at other dimensions, like temporal dimension, to add into this and start to get a more complex view of our customer. And now we're starting to get a better picture. So and this could be the combination of temporal and transactional data. It could also be the combination of transactional and maybe IVR data or other sources that we have. But this, again, is only part of the picture. So as we go past this, we see that there is a third dimension of spatial data. And we're already gathering all of this. IP addresses in your web logs are going to tell you where people are. The mobile agents that they're using, especially if you have mobile apps, are going to give you a very good location of where they are. And you get more and more information. And we're already storing a lot of this, but we're not doing anything with it. So this is sort of trapped in all of these different departmental solutions. And our challenge is really to get this out and build a deep context around that aspect of our organization we're looking at, in this case, a customer. There's actually kind of a fourth dimension, which is to pull between all of those different systems, but other than some sort of gravitational pull field, I couldn't think of a good graphic for it, so I didn't bother putting it up. But this kind of sounds familiar, right? I'm pretty sure some vendor or consultant tried to sell this to you maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I know my company that I worked for 10 years ago tried to sell this. And how is it different? How is Hadoop different, or using Hadoop to solve these problems different than before? This is actually a fundamental issue because previous solutions or current technologies, things like OLAP solutions, the technology really requires, and this isn't Microsoft specific, that you at least have the question before you start building the solution. And that's because the dimensional models you build, the ETL you build, all these other things you're going to build require that you know the questions you're going to ask. And then if you have to go change that dimensional model, it tends to be a lot of work. So it's not easy to go change the question after you've already built the solution. And that's sort of the real challenge. And this is something where Hadoop gets around this. And it's really enabling us to work with the departmentalization that built our fragmented enterprise rather than work against it. So solutions like this in the past that have been pushed top-down, single version of the truth, enterprise-wide solutions that cost millions of dollars and don't really go anywhere, that's why they failed, because they're not fitting the model of the organization that they're fitting into. And really what this gets to is the concept of Agile Analytics. So instead of building analytics that are static or that are thought up deeply ahead of time, what we really want to do is get to the self-service model, where we can surface information, our users are free to use it, to explore it, to decide what they're going to do with it. This is lower cost to implement, it's incremental, it actually fits with the model that most organizations work in, which is this fragmented model. And that sort of begs the question, how do you eat an elephant, right? And I like this graphic because it's, Hadoop, and the elephant is their logo. So, this idea of building this enterprise-wide view of all of your information is a big challenge. And people who've tried to do it all at once have continually failed. And by doing it one bite at a time, how you would eat an elephant, this is the only real way to succeed at this. Any questions so far? Okay, good. So the way that we've done this and succeeded with this is to start very simple. And I think pretty much everything in life, it's always a good idea to start simple. And that's with storage. The way that we look at storage, that isn't really that visible on here. The way that we look at storage in most environments is cost per terabyte, really. And when our infrastructure team, which is pretty sizable, costs and sells solutions that require storage, we generally price SAN storage at about $5,000 per terabyte. That's not a small amount. It's not, I mean, I think it's high, but I guess it's not that high. But when we price Hadoop-based storage, you're really looking at a price that's about $500 per terabyte or lower. So you're talking about an order of magnitude decrease in storage costs. So this is a great place to start because it's easy to sell this idea. And in fact, most of the data that we store in our enterprises is not relational data anyhow. In fact, about 80% of new data created is non-relational, or unstructured, if you would. And how we can use this to our advantage is by reducing those storage costs and then doing something with that leftover or saved money there. The place I like to start with this is with logs. So if you look at any of the logs in your enterprise, especially things like web logs or diagnostics logs, they generally aren't saved for very long. And this is a byproduct of cost, usually. I know almost every server I've looked at, Windows Server, they just set the feature to start overwriting the log when it reaches a certain size so that the server won't run out of log space and stop logging or crash. But then, if you have a big event or a big problem or a long-term problem, you really can't go back and look at the log data anymore. So what's useful about this is things like web logs or event logs or trace logs, that's not relational data anyway. So you don't really need to put it in a fast data store or in a relational data store. You could just put it to some low-cost storage like Hadoop and afford to keep it around for a long time. And then start to build analytics on top of it. Or really just start to open up the platform to let others build analytics with it. And web logs are a great example because they're simple tabular files, especially if they're coming out of, well, I think every web server does simple tabular files, but IISs are very simple. And you can put a Hive projection on top of it and then let your users start to slice it and dice it the way they want in the tools that they already know. And again, going back to that whole compartmentalized or fragmented approach, a great way to do this is by approaching departments that will be helpful to you getting this done. Your development or IT department is going to be one of them. Whoever's building or running your websites will almost certainly be happy to have a longer term history of those logs around and want to be able to analyze them in an easier way than the raw text files that they come out of the web server as. And surprisingly, I shouldn't say surprisingly, but marketing departments actually tend to love this data too, especially any sort of logs from web servers or IVRs or something like that. Any sort of customer interaction helps them see how people are using the site and what they might want to change about the design. So this is a great place to start. The barrier to entry is very low. If you're using something like HDInsight, you don't even need to run Linux in your environment to do it. You still get all the benefits and all the tooling. It really is Apache Hadoop. And you can build beyond this. This is just the start. Again, it's incremental. One of the other things that's almost in every Microsoft enterprise is ETL. There's ETL everywhere because there are so many of these departmental solutions. So a lot of this ETL is importing or exporting text files or CSV files. It's moving data from one database to another or prepping it for OLAP. And all of this ETL is in place and it's running, and usually your IT staff is going to be aware of it. And it presents a great opportunity to sort of tap into existing processes to get data out. For instance, when you're trying to build that view of the customer from all around, you might be able to get the customer's username or IP address, but you are going to need to know other information. You can usually dip into one of these ETL jobs and get some of that information. And so it's trying to reuse all the pieces that you have, trying to work with what you have rather than work against it, that incrementally adds this sort of value. So this is a good question, I guess. Why go through all this trouble? It really comes down to a pretty simple concept. And that's that most organizations view their customer in a very primitive, limited way. They don't really understand their customer that well. And it's because it's difficult to. It's because we don't have the resources or time to rebuild everything we have. And the incremental growth that's sort of a part of almost every organization results in this fragmentation that makes the image blurrier and blurrier and blurrier until all we have is the stick man here. And so that is not really a good representation of a person or of a customer. Some organizations who've tried very hard at this for a long time can come up with a better representation. They can sort of see an outline. They can see that this is a man. He's walking. They see a little bit of the picture. It's still not really in high resolution, though. It's just a piece of the puzzle, and a small piece at that. But this isn't actually our customer. This is our customer's shadow, right? This is just a glimpse. What we really need to be able to see is our actual customer, the person at the end. And if we're trying to build an organization that serves our customer well, whether that's an internet company, an insurance company, a bank, a telephone company, we really need to know about that customer, about interactions with that customer. An example I like to use is a cable TV provider. I had my cable out a few weeks ago, and I call my provider, and they don't even know that it's out, and I have to report it and all these different things. And they have the capability to know about outages, but it's in a different system than in their IVR system, in their customer contact system. So they don't know that's why I'm calling it. They do know every TV show I watch, and so they should know that, well, Formula One season's starting back up. It switched channels in America. I'm calling. Maybe I want to get the new channel that I need to watch Formula One, but they don't. So they're kind of flying blind on that. And this is important because it means how you interact with your customer. If I'm calling in and there's an outage in my area, I'm going to have a very different outlook on you as a company or as a provider than if I'm calling in to add something to my subscription. And if you try to sell me on something for my subscription when I'm having a bad user experience, it's probably not going to help my perception of you as a provider. It's probably going to do quite the opposite and make me want to switch providers. And so this is what this is really presenting the challenge to us, is how do we get the right view, the context of our interaction with our customer or with our product or with our brand. And really that's sort of what the key to all of this is understanding your data, because that's going to define the world that your company lives in or your organization lives in. And the ways that we can do this with Hadoop, and I kind of want to have a little discussion now, are using those tools, specifically those higher level tools, to interact with the experience that our users already have. So again, it's not about replacing what you have, it's about working with it. And that's why a lot of people sort of at first saw Hadoop as some sort of threat to data warehousing, when in reality Hadoop's just another aspect of information management in our enterprise. That's why it might be surprising to some to know that Microsoft, which has a huge investment in data warehousing, is actually probably the number 2 contributor to the Hadoop code base. They see the value in that, and they're staying completely Apache compliant with what they're doing and returning their code back to the community because they see that value. Has anyone in the audience worked with HDInsight yet, the Hadoop data platform? Excellent. So I guess that's the other big thing was this week, HDInsight, which is Microsoft's distribution, became a public beta on Azure. And this is actually an interesting story too, because I talked about the cost of storage a little bit, and that $5,000 or $500 per terabyte piece is part of that cost of storage. When you look at something like Azure, the cost of storage goes down to something like $70 in the US. I don't know what it is here. $70 per terabyte per month. And that's a really low cost, especially if you don't need 100 terabytes or something, and most organizations don't. I've heard recently someone said that most organizations have a lot of they don't have a big data problem. They have a bunch of small data problems, and that's really kind of what it's all about. So HDInsight's available both on-premise and in the cloud, and it's a very compelling solution because you can move between them, and because you don't necessarily need to be having the whole environment and cluster available all the time to use it. And the last thing I kind of want to mention, getting back to my system administrators I was a little bit making fun of, is that things like the management software for Hadoop can make this really easy. So scaling on a SAN or NAS is expensive because you're buying this chassis, big piece of equipment, and sticking drives in it. And when you put in that last drive and you run out of that space, you sort of hit a wall. And the next thing you have is a very large capital expenditure to get another rack to hold more drives in. And so instead of being a linear growth, it jumps, and you don't really have that problem with Hadoop. because you can just keep expanding. And tools like System Center will make that really easy. So adding a new server to your cluster becomes a very simple process. And things like Azure make that extremely easy, because it sort of happens automatically, actually. So you just have to pay more for it. Any questions? Please.
What about the integration with more centralized data sources like SharePoint or Exchange, and on front-end with Power BI?
Excellent. The question is about integration on the centralized data sources like SharePoint and Exchange, and also on the front end for like Power View. I'll start with the Power View one, because that's actually that's the thing I find the most exciting. It's an ODBC driver, and there's an add-in for Excel. And I know it works with 2013. I think it actually works with Excel 2010 also. And what's funny about that is when I say opening up the power of this stuff to your users, we do hackathons at my firm, and we did one a couple months ago where we're doing basically just a general ledger type problem. And we're a bunch of computer scientists sitting in the room trying to build Hadoop solutions for this problem. And we had one of our management consultants in there with us, and he looks right at it and uses Excel and beat all of us to the solution, which is a little bit embarrassing to say, but at the same time he's using a tool that's better for that job than we were. Oh, it's fairly responsive. It's not as responsive as it would be from hooking up to something like an analysis cube, but it's not that far off, and they're working on making that better. The early statistics out right now are looking at Hive being about 27 times faster in the next releases than it is right now. But if you are looking at a really big data set, then it's actually pretty competitive. So small data, it's slow, but terabytes, it's actually pretty fast. Integrating on the other side then with existing like SharePoint and things like that. SharePoint's a little tricky because you're going to need other tools to do that with. So you might need Flume or Pig or something like that. Flume in particular would probably be better. No, I guess Pig would, because you're going to have to change it from a different format. SharePoint, despite the fact that it's sitting on SQL, isn't really easily accessible as a relational data source. And Exchange being the other one. The way you kind of want to get out of Exchange is just to crawl and dump out the data as much as possible. So really, it's almost the equivalent of dumping out PST files and looking through them that way. Any other questions? Anyone using these pieces right now? Anyone using this stuff in a Windows enterprise? Anyone using them in a Linux enterprise? Well, okay. Well, I encourage you to check them all out. They're free, they're available, they're fun to use, and you can get a lot of results out of them. I think that's all I really had planned to say today, so thank you very much.